The heads-up display that you use in Final Fantasy XIV can be seen as an extension of yourself as a player. There's beauty in how it looks totally different for every single player and how our own preferences translate to the placement of each of these little guys. There is no best or optimal HUD layout, but I am going to teach you some concepts that can help you make better decisions on where to place certain things. I'm going to try to give context on some important elements and show you where I decide to put them on my layout and why, but please don't take that as a call to copy my layout. The purpose of this video is to arm you with the information that you need to make these decisions for yourself. This guide is primarily aimed at raiders, but even if you prefer to do other things in the game, you should still be able to learn a thing or two. This also isn't necessarily a guide on how to edit your HUD, it's more about the placements of certain elements. I'm going to assume you already know how to enter the HUD layout editor and move stuff around, change their size, and so on. I am going to reset this HUD layout to default for a fresh start. Two things that you should know before we begin are that I'm playing on a 1080p monitor at a 16:9 aspect ratio with a default HUD size of 100%. If you're on a 1440p or 4K monitor or an ultra wide, you'll need to use larger sizes and make your own adjustments. God, this default HUD is a huge mess, so I'm gonna clean things up a little. There we go, I kind of have everything out of the way now, and we have a blank canvas to build with. Let's begin by identifying the most important place on the screen that should never be obstructed, and that's your character's feet. You need to be able to clearly see your feet to resolve like 80% of the mechanics in this game, so it's important that you don't block this area. Also, you can adjust your camera's vertical angle by going into character configuration and scrolling down and finding the third-person camera angle here. Some people like to have their character super low on the screen so they can see up higher in front of them, but I prefer mine to be a little closer to the center, so that's where I'm going to keep it. We're going to be using our feet as our center point for basically every other HUD element, so set this slider to a place that you like before you continue. Everything else will grow out from this point in order of importance. That way, when we're doing mechanics and looking at our feet, the most important stuff is just a quick glance away. So let's start placing HUD elements. And while we're on the topic of doing mechanics, let's begin by placing the few HUD elements that you need for doing mechanics. The first one being your debuffs. Tons of raid mechanics in this game give you debuffs as a way of telling you what your job is for a mechanic. So having this HUD element visible front and center is very important. You can split your debuffs off into their own HUD element by clicking on the settings for the status effects bar and selecting split element into 3 or 4 groups. I'll explain the difference between 3 and 4 a little bit later. I'm going to pick 4. And this gives us the status info enfeeblements bar. I like to have mine right beside my character, and I even make it a little bit bigger so that I can see it better. We're going to do 110, and I'm going to stack it 10 by 2 so that it doesn't take up too much room horizontally. There's a few ways to give yourself a debuff so that you can test this. The easiest, if you have it unlocked, is to be a blue mage. Oh god, what have I done? Where are my bars? If you go blue mage, you can explode yourself. And then this gives you the brush with death debuff for 10 minutes. But if you don't want to do that, then you can go into the dungeon, the 1,000 Maws of Totorak in Explorer mode, and then you can teleport to the final boss area, and you can stand in the green goo, and it should give you a debuff. The next important thing we need to place is your target's cast bar. We use this to see what the boss is casting and when. You can go to your target bar, click into the settings, and select display target info independently. This splits it off into 3 different elements, one of which is the progress bar. I like to have mine right below my character, and I make it quite a bit bigger so that the text is easier to read. We're going to do 140. Up next, we're going to be placing our party list. Now, there's lots of places you could put the party list, but let's talk about left side versus right side placement. With the party list on the left side of the screen, you're putting the group buffs and debuffs closer to the center, which can help you make quicker glances at this information when it's required, like in raids like DSR, for example. However, I'm a healer main, and placing the party list on the right side of the screen means that my party's health bars are closer to the center. I'm sure you can agree that health bars are pretty important to be able to see when you're on healer, and it's for this reason that I choose to have my party list on the right side. It's kind of big by default, so I'm going to lower it down to 80%. If you typically play tanks or DPS, you might want it on the left. It's your call. You can also choose where vertically to place your party list. Some people like to have it lower vertically so that you're not blocking as much of your view up top, but personally I value having the health bars closer to the center over having that extra real estate. Up next, we're going to be placing our cast bar, or the progress bar as the game calls it. If I can find it, there it is. This HUD element is significantly more important to you if you play casters, but if you never touch a job with a cast bar, then you can put this somewhere further away than where I do. I like to have mine below my character, right below the target cast bar. This puts both mine and my target's cast bars in the same place, and also lets me see my cast bar in my peripheral vision while I'm looking at my feet, which helps me with slide casting. I think default's a little too big. We're gonna put it at 90%. You'll probably notice that I'm like very particular about pixel perfect placements. You can use arrow keys or the D-pad on a controller to move the selected HUD element 1 pixel at a time. Now we're going to be placing the health and mana bars. The game calls them the parameter bar. The placement of this one actually really depends on the jobs you play. Jobs where mana is a foundational resource to your rotations like Black Mage and Dark Knight will probably want this pretty close to the center. Mana is obviously a pretty important resource for healers, but you're usually only looking at it when something is going horribly wrong, and I think it's okay to look a little further to find this when you need it. And because of that, I actually like to have mine down at the bottom of the screen, and default is way too big. I'm going to put it down to 80%. And of course, some jobs just don't use mana at all, which really lowers the importance of this element. Up next is my target's health bar and status info. Let me move all this crap out of the way. A lot of people like to have this on the bottom next to all the other important info, and I used to have it like that too. Over time, I found that this HUD element is really big. It takes up a ton of space for something that I'm only really ever looking at every 25 to 30 seconds to refresh my dot. And for that reason, I make it a bit smaller and I put it up top pretty close to its default position. There's one last important thing that we'll be placing, which is your buffs or your enhancements. I like to have mine just below my cast bar. I'm only ever really looking at this element during bursts to see the timers or to make sure that my mitigation is covering a damage snapshot. With just these elements that we've placed so far, you should have a pretty solid foundation for filling in the rest of your HUD. There is still one more important section of things to place that we'll get to later, so keep some room around the center of the screen. Before we get there, I'm going to place most of the other less important stuff. Your hotbars are going to be pretty personalized to your hotkey setup and whether or not you use an MMO mouse or a controller. Personally, I just use 3 hotbars stacked vertically, so I'm going to go ahead and place those now. One thing to mention about my enhancements here on top of my hotbars is that when I'm in the middle of my rotation and I need to quickly glance at my enhancements or my buffs, having this little reverse indent here actually helps me subconsciously locate the buff bar quicker. If it's flush with the side of the hotbars like this, it kind of all just blends together and looks like a bunch of icons. It makes it take a little longer for me to get the info that I need. But when it sticks out on the left side like this, it's really easy for my eyes just to find where it sticks out and find the bar that way. I don't really ever use my focus target, but if I did, I would probably want that somewhere close to the center, like around here. I like to have my limit gauge right above my party list. I just make it super small and move it right on top. It fits pretty well here. Since I have my party list on the right side, I move my duty list over to the top left so that it does not overlap with the party list. It also doesn't need to be that big. Get all the stuff out of the top corner too. Your mini-map might be something very important to you, especially if you play tank. You can move it closer to the center if that's the case. I know a lot of people sometimes even have their mini-map right in the center of the screen. Personally, I just like having mine in the default position. I actually even make it a slight amount smaller. The enemy list is a bit more important if you're playing tank, but even if you're not playing tank, it's still kind of important to be able to see cast bars of other enemies that you're not targeting. I personally just like to have this on the opposite side of the screen from my party list. Okay, I'm going to quickly place the rest of these less important HUD elements, and then we'll move on to the last section. I actually totally turn off my pet hotbar, and that's because when I'm playing Scholar, I use a macro for placing my pet, and this is basically the only thing that you actually need the pet hotbar for, so it can just go away. I like to hide my experience bar, and I like to hide the scenario guide as well, and I normally only just turn this on whenever there's a new patch or expansion drop. Okay, the last set of important things will be your job gauges, and if you choose to use one, a cooldown bar. Almost all job gauges are really important, and you should place them as such. Really, the only exceptions are the Scholar's Fairy Gauge and Sage's Eucrasia Indicator. I don't know why they don't let me hide this. You can hide it now? Wait, you can hide this now? You never used to be able to hide this. Oh, this is good. I always used to hide it behind my minimap because I did not want to see it. But they let you hide it now. That's awesome. That must be new. You'll need to place each job gauge element for each job individually. It's kind of a pain. But before we do that, let's talk about cooldown bars. This is simply an extra hotbar with no keybinds on it that you use just to monitor ability cooldowns. How much stuff you put in here, or even if you use one at all, is totally up to you. But I found that once I got used to using one, it made it possible to quickly glance in just one spot and have all the information I need about my important cooldowns, my resources, my upcoming burst windows, and so on. So I'm just going to pull over hotbar 4. I'm going to make it just a tiny bit smaller, and you can see I already actually have my abilities on there. If you are going to use one of these, I find that less is more here. The more things you put on this bar, the more information you need to sift through to get the info that you need. So I just stick to putting only the super important foundational cooldowns here, like my raid buffs and other things that I want to be on cooldown 100% of the time. Let's talk about that one setting from the status bar earlier, which is setting it to splitting it into 3 or 4 groups. If you split it into 4 groups, it gives you this additional conditional enhancements bar, which is useful for jobs that have procs or charges granted by their abilities. So as a Sage, it shows up with Eucrasia. If I'm a Dark Knight and I use Delirium, it'll show up with my remaining charges of Delirium and Blood Weapon. And if I'm a Dancer, it'll show up when I get procs of my abilities like Silk and Symmetry. It's not very often that I actually need to see these icons, but when I do want to see them, I want them to be readily available. So that's why I actually put them right next to my debuffs, just on the opposite side of my character. Okay, this is looking mostly done. I'm just going to make a couple more adjustments here. You're going to want to make sure you check the duty checkbox here so that you can move your duty gauge and duty action. Okay, I quite like where everything is here. I'm going to go take it for a test run. As I mentioned in the intro, your HUD is something that will evolve with you over time, and as you learn to prioritize different things as a player. You shouldn't just set it and forget it, and you certainly shouldn't just copy what I have here. I want you to constantly go back to that HUD layout editor and make minor adjustments until you run out of things that you want to change. If you have any questions or want some opinions on where to place certain things under certain cases, just leave a comment and I'll get back to you, or you can head over to my Twitch stream and ask in the chat there. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you were able to learn something.